On January 15, 1947, the brutally bisected body of Elizabeth Short was discovered on a vacant lot at the corner of South Norton Avenue in Los Angeles. The Black Dahlia case quickly became one of the most shocking and haunting murder cases in American history, dominating newspaper headlines for months. Nearly 80 years have passed. It has long been regarded as one of the most famous cold cases, with thousands of pages of records, hundreds of witnesses, and numerous suspects identified by the LAPD. Yet, to this day, no one has ever been convicted. What is particularly striking is that recent discoveries suggest many things are not as the LAPD originally presented them. Documents and pieces of evidence once considered lost or irrelevant are now revealing suspicious gaps in the official investigation. Why was a case filled with clues never able to bring the killer to justice? And what is it about the LAPD that we still do not know? Let's uncover the truth behind the Black Dahlia case. But to understand why the Black Dahlia case could remain obscured and unresolved for nearly 80 years, we need to take a closer look at the victim herself, Elizabeth Short. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924 in Medford, Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 daughters. Her childhood was far from easy. Her father, Cleo Short, abandoned the family during the Great Depression by faking his own suicide and fleeing to California. Her mother was left to raise 5 children alone while struggling through relentless poverty. Growing up in hardship, Elizabeth became a beautiful and ambitious young woman, but also one who carried deep insecurities. At the age of 19, she moved to California to pursue the Hollywood dream. She wanted to become an actress. She wanted to escape the exhausting working-class life she had known on the East Coast. But reality proved far harsher than she had imagined. Elizabeth never became a movie star. She worked as a waitress, a cashier, and occasionally landed a few small, uncredited roles. She constantly moved between Los Angeles, San Diego, and Santa Barbara. She had no permanent home, no stable job, and no family nearby. She lived in cheap rented rooms and often relied on men for a place to stay or spending money. She dated many men, most of them American servicemen during the post-war era. These relationships were usually brief and lacked depth. Elizabeth was not the seductive and dangerous femme fatale that the media would later deliberately portray her as. She was simply a lonely 22-year-old woman longing to be loved and recognized, yet completely lacking protection from either her family or society. When Elizabeth Short disappeared on January 9, 1947, and her body was found 6 days later, no one was truly panicked or actively searching for her from the very beginning. There was no close family nearby pressuring the police. No wealthy relatives stood behind her demanding justice. She was simply an unknown, beautiful young woman in a Hollywood city filled with temptation and danger. It was precisely Elizabeth's isolation and instability that made her the perfect victim. Someone whose disappearance or murder could easily descend into chaos and be forgotten amid countless investigative mistakes. And that is exactly what happened. The Black Dahlia case was not simply a murder. It was a horrifying shock to post-war America. In 1947, Los Angeles was still basking in the optimism that followed victory in World War II. The city was growing rapidly, and Hollywood stood as a symbol of the American dream. Murders at the time were usually driven by jealousy, robbery, or gang conflicts, typically straightforward and easy to understand. There had never been a precedent for a case involving such extreme levels of torture, mutilation, and symbolic staging of a body. Elizabeth Short was not merely killed. She was tortured for hours. Her body was bisected with surgical precision, completely drained of blood, thoroughly cleaned, and publicly posed like a work of horrific art. This level of brutality and depravity was something even the most experienced LAPD detectives had never witnessed before. The case quickly became the first true nightmare of modern America. It marked the beginning of a new era, an era in which serial murders, sex crimes, and senseless violence began appearing openly in newspaper headlines. Within days, the Black Dahlia case dominated the front pages of newspapers across the country, placing enormous pressure on Los Angeles authorities and law enforcement. Under that pressure, the LAPD was forced to respond with an unprecedented effort. It became the largest criminal investigation in the city's history at the time. Hundreds of officers were assigned full-time, the FBI assisted with identity verification, and thousands of people were questioned. Everyone believed that with such a massive operation, the killer would surely be caught quickly. Yet within just a few weeks, the investigation began descending into chaos and was gradually destroyed from within. The biggest problem stemmed from excessive media interference. Newspapers within the Hearst chain, particularly the Los Angeles Examiner, effectively turned themselves into a parallel investigative agency. On January 24, 1947, the newspaper received a package containing Elizabeth Short's personal belongings. Instead of preserving it intact and handing it over to the police, newsroom employees opened the package, handled the evidence directly, photographed it, and immediately published the images. Some items were even wiped down with gasoline. The chain of custody was completely destroyed from the very first moment. The press continued revealing internal details, publicly identifying witnesses before they could be formally interviewed, and publishing crime scene information that made it easier for the killer to conceal evidence. Several witnesses were threatened or changed their statements after being exposed publicly. Years later, the Los Angeles County Grand Jury conducted its own investigation and heavily criticized the LAPD's handling of the case. Numerous important documents disappeared for unknown reasons. Files were missing pages. Physical evidence was damaged or rendered unusable in court. At first, many believed this was simply the typical incompetence of a major investigation conducted during an era when forensic science was still limited. But the closer one looks, the more suspicious everything becomes. Too many mistakes, too many key pieces of evidence destroyed at exactly the right time, too many important documents disappearing at the most sensitive moments. And nearly every mistake led to the same outcome, making it increasingly difficult to ever bring the case to justice. This was no longer merely a failed investigation. It looked more like an investigation that had been deliberately neutralized. But despite the countless serious failures in preserving evidence, the names that appeared on the suspect list were notable and compelling enough to shock anyone who examined them. As mentioned earlier, Elizabeth Short's life revolved around many men, but they were not ordinary men. She lived in the whirlwind of post-war Hollywood, a world where power, money, desire, and darkness constantly intertwined. During the final months of her life, she came into contact with a group of influential and well-connected men, many of whom displayed unmistakably dangerous traits. Mark Hansen was one of the most prominent names. He owned several famous nightclubs in Los Angeles and maintained close ties to the underworld and influential figures throughout the city. Hansen had a fairly close relationship with Elizabeth. Many witnesses stated that he was obsessed with her, intensely jealous, and frequently gave her gifts and paid for her lodging. When Elizabeth began distancing herself from him, Hansen became extremely resentful. He owned a large house and had access to numerous secluded locations, places that could potentially be used to detain and torture someone without attracting attention. Next was Leslie Dillon, an extremely suspicious figure. Dillon not only knew many details about the case that police had never made public, but he was also connected to a Los Angeles motel where bloodstains and signs of torture were later discovered. Dillon was obsessed with sexual violence and displayed disturbing behavior when discussing women. He wrote letters and provided information to police in such a strange manner that many suspected he was simultaneously concealing and boasting about the crime. Another suspect who attracted significant attention was Dr. Walter Bayley, a respected surgeon. He lived only a few hundred meters from the vacant lot where Elizabeth's body was discovered. Bayley possessed the surgical skills necessary to bisect a body with the precision seen in the case. Even more surprising, his family had indirect connections to Elizabeth Short's family from years earlier. Late in life, Bayley exhibited unusual behavior and made comments to relatives that seemed to allude to the Black Dahlia case. These men were not drifters or street criminals. They were wealthy, socially prominent individuals with private homes and connections to Los Angeles high society. Elizabeth Short, a young woman who was alone, broke, and powerless, had found herself within their circle. The LAPD questioned all of these men. Some were placed under surveillance, while others were interviewed multiple times. Yet in the end, none of them were arrested or prosecuted. One by one, critical leads were either ignored or deemed not convincing enough. Yet among the hundreds of names that have appeared in the Black Dahlia case files over the years, one name keeps returning like a shadow that refuses to disappear: Dr. George Hodel. Hodel was an exceptionally intelligent physician. As a child, he was regarded as a prodigy. As an adult, he ran a successful venereal disease clinic, accumulated considerable wealth, and maintained connections with artists, businessmen, and members of Hollywood's elite. He lived in a famous Mayan revival mansion in Los Feliz, where lavish parties attended by influential figures were frequently held. But behind the image of a successful doctor lay a series of controversies that would make his life a subject of enduring fascination and suspicion. In 1949, his daughter, Tamar Hodel, accused him of sexually abusing her from a young age. The allegations shocked the public at the time. Although George Hodel was ultimately acquitted due to insufficient evidence, the accusations left many questioning the true nature of the man behind the polished exterior. Some researchers have since argued that these accounts reveal a complex personality, brilliant, controlling, and seemingly convinced that ordinary rules did not apply to him. But were such traits enough to make him a murderer? That is an entirely different question. One of the details that elevated George Hodel to the top of many suspect lists was his close friendship with the renowned surrealist artist Man Ray. Hodel was reportedly an admirer of Man Ray's work and deeply influenced by surrealist art. Years later, some researchers noted striking similarities between the positioning of Elizabeth Short's body and certain famous surrealist artworks. Was it merely a coincidence, or had someone deliberately staged the crime scene as a grotesque work of art? No one can say for certain. Yet those similarities have ensured that Hodel's name remains at the center of speculation. There are also theories suggesting that Hodel may have known Elizabeth Short or moved within circles connected to her. However, no definitive evidence has ever emerged proving that the two actually met. Then, in 1950, a remarkable development occurred. The Los Angeles Police Department secretly placed listening devices inside Hodel's home and monitored conversations for several weeks. Among the recordings was a statement that continues to be discussed whenever the Black Dahlia case is revisited. "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now." Was this a confession, or merely the provocative remark of a man who knew he was under suspicion? Even investigators at the time could not answer that question with certainty. The statement alone was far from enough to support a criminal conviction. What troubled many observers even more was the fact that despite extensive surveillance and serious suspicion, George Hodel was never charged in connection with the Black Dahlia murder. There were no eyewitnesses, no conclusive forensic evidence, no formal confession. He understood the legal system well. And if he were somehow involved, did he know exactly how to stay beyond the reach of prosecutors? Or was law enforcement simply too focused on a high-profile suspect, while the real killer remained elsewhere? After George Hodel died in 1991, the debate reignited from an unexpected source. His son, Steve Hodel, a former LAPD detective, began investigating his own father. Through a series of books and research projects, Steve claimed to have discovered photographs believed to depict Elizabeth Short among his father's personal belongings, along with other details that he believed linked George Hodel to the crime. Yet Steve Hodel's conclusions have remained controversial. Some independent investigators consider his findings compelling and worthy of serious attention. Others argue that the evidence still falls short of proving George Hodel was the killer. Many experts continue to maintain that the case has never been conclusively solved. And so, nearly 8 decades later, George Hodel remains a paradox. He may be the most suspicious figure ever connected to the Black Dahlia case, but he may also be a man whose name became permanently tied to one of America's most infamous unsolved murders without anyone ever proving his guilt. So, what is the truth? Did George Hodel really take that secret with him to the grave? Or has the true killer of Elizabeth Short never been identified at all? To this day, no one can answer with certainty. More than 79 years have passed since Elizabeth Short's body was discovered on that vacant lot in Los Angeles. To this day, the Black Dahlia case remains officially unsolved. No one has ever been convicted. No charges have ever been filed. But when looking back at the entire story, a disturbing theory slowly emerges. Perhaps this case wasn't simply forgotten. It was deliberately buried. Look at how everything unfolded. The press, especially the Hearst newspaper empire, rushed to the scene and handled evidence within hours. They opened the killer's package, touched the items directly, photographed them, and published everything long before the LAPD could secure the scene. Meanwhile, law enforcement always seemed to be one step behind. Mistakes kept happening, critical documents disappeared, and the chain of custody was destroyed almost from the very beginning. Was this just random incompetence? Or was there silent cooperation between a media machine hungry for sensational headlines to sell papers and elements within the LAPD that were either manipulated or hesitant to reach firm conclusions? These questions become even heavier when focusing on the man who repeatedly appeared at the center of every major lead, a man of status, wealth, and powerful connections. Despite a mountain of circumstantial evidence pointing in his direction, the case never reached any resolution. We cannot say for certain what truly happened, but we have every right to ask, why did the system so easily back down in the face of such a suspect? Could it be that he wasn't just an ordinary doctor, but part of a powerful network that no one dared to touch? Elizabeth Short, a lonely young woman with no money, no power, and no one to protect her, was failed while she was alive. And even after her death, the truth about her murder was also failed. Evidence was destroyed, witnesses were silenced, and powerful names remained untouchable. Elizabeth Short deserved justice. She deserved to be remembered as a human being, not just a horrifying headline. But perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of this case. The Black Dahlia was never an unsolvable mystery. It was simply a truth that was deliberately made impossible to prove. If you found this story thought-provoking, please like the video to support the channel. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe George Hodel was the real killer? Or was there a larger force at play? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss future true crime cases. Thank you for watching. See you in the next episode.